Okay, so now this is part 2 of the stylistic revision. We're talking about 7 different ways to improve your writing that are not necessarily just grammatical issues. They're more of stylistic changes that will spice up your writing. And so we've talked about the first 4 already. We talked about sentence length. We talked about parallel construction, talked about using active rather than passive voice, and we talked about using action verbs rather than the verb to be. So you can go back and review that if you can't remember what those are all talking about. But now let's move on to the next one, and I got an example here for you. William Shakespeare, he's so great, and he has many examples of this next one. So here's an example from Hamlet. It says, "The rooster that is the trumpet of the morning," and I'll be really excited if you guys know at home. I'm not going to make you answer this in any way, but if you know at home what that is an example of, I'll be really excited. And it's a metaphor. Okay, so number 5 is to use figurative language. Figurative language doesn't just include these 3 that I have listed here, but it does include metaphors, similes, and personifications. Please highlight this stylistic revision method in purple on your notes. One thing I would say is that some of you guys are just absolutely poetic, beautiful writers. And so this figure of language sometimes flows naturally out of you, and that's awesome. And while I do encourage those that don't typically use figurative language to think about ways you can incorporate figurative language in your work, the truth is you can go overboard with it too, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so don't include a metaphor every other sentence. But if you don't have any in your work, it might be a good idea to add some. Okay, add some figurative language and really allow your creative juices to flow. All right, the next one is to be concise. This is one that honor students in particular have trouble with sometimes because, again, the misconception is that we use really long sentences to make us sound smarter. And that's not necessarily true. Sometimes you use really long sentences and then they get so muddy that the clarity is lacking, okay? So I'm going to talk about some ways to be concise in just a second, but please highlight this stylistic revision method in orange on your notes. Okay, so you see on my screen it says, "Good writers waste no words." If your writing is long on words but short on meaning, here are a few techniques to help you focus. So here we go. These are some ways that you can be concise and start to cut back some of your wordiness. Number 1, avoid redundancy. Okay, redundancy is when you have 2 or more words or sentences that say essentially the same thing. Okay, for example, we start with the word recklessly, and then in between the commas it says, "and without thought of the consequences." But isn't recklessly the exact same thing as doing something without thought of consequences? Okay, so instead of saying recklessly and without thought of the consequences he veered in the passing lane, you can just eliminate without thought of consequences and say recklessly he veered into the passing lane. Okay, so again, avoid that redundancy by eliminating things that essentially say the same thing. Okay, number 2, avoid patterns like "there are who" and "it is that." First of all, they make you sound like you're in 4th grade, but let's look at the examples. Okay, the first one says, "There are many women who have to work." Okay, you don't have to use that phrase "there are who." Instead, take those out and just say "many women have to work." Okay, it's just a matter of being wordy there. Okay, same thing down at the bottom. "It is lying that breeds distrust." You could just say "lying breeds distrust" and eliminate "it is" and "that." Okay, so do you guys kind of get the idea, hopefully? But eliminate words that are totally needless. All right. Another way to be concise is to, whenever possible, turn nouns into verbs. This one's kind of a tricky one, but let's look at it. The first sentence I have is, "The reason for his trip to Spain was his desire to see a bullfight." Okay, what I have kind of in bold on that sentence are all of the nouns. Okay, and we're going to try and turn some of those nouns into verbs. So now the next one down, instead of "the reason for his trip to Spain was," you could just say "he went to Spain because." Okay, again, instead of his desire to see a bullfight, you could just say he wanted to see a bullfight. Notice that desire is a noun, but we're changing that to wanted, which is a verb. Okay, so it would read, the second one down goes, he went to Spain because he wanted to see a bullfight. But I think that we can even do better than that. Okay, he went to Spain. That's a good solid start. You can't really cut that down too much. But instead of saying because he wanted to see a bullfight, you could just say he went to Spain to see a bullfight. I think it's implied that he wanted to do so because he did it, right? And that was the intention of him going to Spain. That's what's clear in that sentence. So again, when it's possible, if you have too many nouns in a sentence, think about ways you can turn those into verbs and really condense your sentence, okay? Another way you can be concise is to cut adjective clauses like who are, which was, and that have been. Look at the example there. Students who are in the band have to practice 4 days a week. Okay, you don't really need who are, so if you eliminate that, you just get students in the band have to practice 4 days a week. Okay, that's a way to just real quick trim some of your sentences and eliminate some of that wordiness. Another way to be concise, number 5, says whenever possible, replace prepositional phrases with single words. Okay, this is going to be a tricky one for some of you because you guys are still a little fuzzy on what prepositional phrases are. But let's look at the example. It says, she spoke in regard to water pollution. You don't really need in regard to. Instead, you can have the word about. She spoke about water pollution. Okay, so again, don't try and add extra words into your sentences because you think it might make you sound smarter. Sometimes being clear and concise is actually the smarter route. Okay, one more way you can be concise. Avoid using to be after any form of the verb consider. Okay, so this one is a really common one, and I find myself doing it too, so I'll work on it as well. But here's your example. Shakespeare is considered to be the greatest playwright. Okay, you actually don't need the words to be there because it reads a little bit easier as Shakespeare is considered the greatest playwright. Okay, so these again are just real quick small tricks for you to make your writing more concise and even less and eliminate wordiness and increase clarity. Okay. All right. Now you've probably heard this phrase before, but we can all have a funeral because said is dead. Okay. Number 7, and this is your last kind of stylistic revision method that I'd like you to use in your stylistic revision assignment, and that is to use more interesting reporting verbs. Okay. Again, said is dead. We've heard it and we've overused it to the max. So try using a different reporting verb when introducing a quote. Look at the difference. The first one says, in her article, Dr. Lee says, and then her quote. The second one, in her article, Dr. Lee asserts, and then her quote. If you say says too many times, man, it gets annoying to read. And we've talked about this before, but now I'm going to kind of force you to practice eliminating says and using different reporting verbs. On Canvas, there's a list of different reporting verbs that might be helpful for you because in your stylistic revision assignment, you're going to need to eliminate every says verb and replace it with a more interesting reporting verb. Okay, so again, your assignment, let's go over it real quick. On your interviews reflection, you're going to demonstrate each of the 7 methods of stylistic revision at least once in your writing assignment. Real quick on the number 6 that says being concise, I showed you numerous ways to be concise, but you still only have to demonstrate one revision of conciseness, okay? So for the 7th as well, kind of the opposite is true. Every single said verb that you have, you're going to need to replace it with a different reporting verb, either from the list on Canvas or whatever, and then circle it. You will be submitting the PDF copy that includes your revisions, your stylistic revisions. On the revised essay, you got to highlight or circle your revisions and make sure that the highlighting colors correspond with the highlights that you have on your notes. So again, you can see it on the right-hand side. Number 1, if you're going to vary your sentence length, you're going to highlight your demonstration of varied sentence length in yellow as it is on your notes. Also, don't forget to demonstrate 2 examples of sentence pattern 1, one with a conjunctive adverb and one without. Okay, so this is due Monday night by 11:59 p.m. Good luck, have fun.